We made a movie in just 2 days. Here is how we did it and what we learned. So recently we took part in the Take48 challenge. This is a film challenge that was organized by the Sydney Underground Film Festival, and just as you would expect, it involves creating a film from start to finish in just 48 hours. I've always wanted to try a challenge like this. This was my first time actually giving it a go. We had a lot of fun, and there are a few things that we learned, so I just wanted to put this video together to share our experience with you as well. On a Friday evening, we received a prompt. And the prompt included 3 things that needed to be included in this film. We would only find out what those things are at 7 p.m. This is one thing that a lot of festivals do to ensure that your film was actually made for that film festival. At 7 p.m. on Friday, we got the prompt. For this one, there was an item that had to be included in the film, there was a line of dialogue, and there was also a shot type. For this challenge, the item was watermelon, the line of dialogue was I thought you should know, and the shot type was an extreme close-up. So we had to include all 3 of these things in some way or another in this film. There were a few things that we did before the challenge actually started so that we could make sure that we are prepared and have the best chance of success. One of these, of course, was equipment checks. So me and the DOP got together, we had a look at all of the equipment that we have available. Thankfully, we both actually happen to own the exact same camera, which means that most of this movie was a multi-cam shoot, which sort of helped us cut down on the time. So we went through all of the equipment. Not only that, I also went through all of the props that we had available. So essentially I cleaned out my shed and anything else that I had and dumped it on the table, because I didn't really know what our story was going to be, and I didn't really know which of those items were going to be important. Another important thing that happened before the challenge actually started is, of course, coming up with some kind of idea. And one decision that I had to make is, do I simply just come up with some ideas and wait until the challenge starts before we decide what we're doing? Or do we decide on the idea beforehand so that we can get started with preparation? So initially, I actually started out thinking that we would actually decide the story once the challenge actually started, once we actually received those prompts. It was only maybe a day or 2 before the challenge actually started that I realized that in order to actually get the locations we wanted, we had to decide on the idea and lock it in advance. This came with a few steps. Firstly, I took about a week or so coming up with a variety of ideas, while also making sure to keep these ideas very simple, since another requirement for this challenge is that it has a 3-minute maximum. The film cannot be any longer than 3 minutes. So I came up with a list of ideas that are relatively simple, but also still fun to watch and hopefully fun to make. I did actually start writing a few of these ideas just to test out how much we could actually accomplish within a 3-minute duration for a story. Another thing that we did is also reach out to the cast and crew to see if anyone else also had some stories that we could use sort of as a standby thing in case we got the prompt and one of these stories would be perfect for that prompt. While coming up with these ideas, as well as writing some of these ideas, I naturally had to start thinking about logistics and how we could actually make these real. An important element with that is locations. An obvious thing that you could do with a challenge like this is just write something that is filmed at your home, and then you don't have to worry about hiring a location and getting permission. But I wanted to do things a little bit differently. I wanted to film something that wasn't in my own home. I wanted it to look just a bit more interesting, and there was a specific feeling that I wanted the film to have. So then a day or 2 before the challenge, we did end up locking in one particular idea because there was a specific location in mind, and if we waited until the challenge started, we wouldn't be able to use that location. It kind of twisted our arm and forced us to choose an idea before we even received that prompt, which means that when I was initially coming up with those various ideas, I was coming up with ideas that had some kind of moment in the film that was adaptable. We could put in a line, we could put in an object. There's a lot of different variations that we could do with that particular scene, for example. Another important step before the challenge actually started was looking at cast and crew. Crew is where we started because we needed to have a crew in order to actually register for this event. The challenge allowed for a maximum of 10 people in the team, and that is not including actors. So we started off locking in a crew. We tried to make it a bit of a skeleton crew since we did have that small number, plus I also really wanted to have someone filming behind the scenes as well. When you are sort of building up a crew for this kind of thing, you can find that 10 can fill up pretty easily. That being said, I think in the end we ended up with maybe around 7 to 8 people. One thing that we couldn't lock in just yet until we had an idea was the cast. So again, that sort of left us with a few decisions to make. Do we find some actors that we know and lock them in for this project? Or do we find a few actors and sort of ask them to be on standby so that then we can adapt to whatever story we choose? We ended up going with the latter, because I feel like if we had locked in actors beforehand, it would just be yet another thing that is kind of limiting us towards maybe certain ideas over others. And this challenge already comes with a lot of limitations, so we really just didn't want to give ourselves even more than needed. We did put out some listings and we got a few actors involved, some that we know and some that we don't. We simply just let them know what is actually happening for this challenge, and we asked people if they are available on the day and if they are also happy to be standby for that shoot date. I did try to keep this in mind when I was creating the story. Because we have all these people on standby, I did want to create plenty of roles so that we could get them all involved, since they were kind enough to secure the date. Finally, the last thing that we did before the challenge actually started is equipment prep. So of course, before the day, we charged all of our batteries, we formatted the cards, we had everything that was ready and easy to access laid out so there wouldn't be as much time getting ready. For the locations, we did end up using 2 locations. The first location was actually my own backyard. This was probably a good choice in one way because it helped cut down on some of that initial setup time, because it can usually take everyone a long time to sort of get things rolling. The second location, as I mentioned, is a location that we did actually hire out. It was actually a bit of a drive. I think from between my house and there is around 30 to 40 minutes, so there was a location move that everyone had to do at some stage. So production started. We were planning for a full 8-hour day. Some crews would stretch that to the maximum of 10, maybe even more than that, but one of my priorities for this project is that it is fun and people actually enjoy their time working on it. What I didn't want is for people to be stressed and overwhelmed, which I know is something that can easily happen with some intense challenges like this. You often get people pulling all-nighters, they'll refuse to eat, they'll refuse to rest, they won't stop until this is done. It isn't really that healthy, and in the long run, it's not that fun, and you do get stressed out. The start of the day does usually take a little while as people start to set up and get ready. One of the first things that we do is a briefing. We get everyone together, we gather around in a circle, and we just go through a quick briefing of what it is that we will be doing that day. We might not necessarily go into exact specifics, but we'll try to give people enough information so that they confidently know what is happening throughout the day. They would have a lot of this information on the call sheet, which we did send out the night before production started. Even though it is on the call sheet, it's good to talk about these things in person, because notoriously people tend to not actually read call sheets. It is still good to have because it has all the emergency contacts, it has all the important information just in case. We got started with filming, and unfortunately the first 2 shots took a full 2 hours to film. This was for a number of reasons. We were battling with the weather. The rain was coming in and out. It was only a light rain, but it was enough to shut us down. So we had to keep running undercover. It would clear up, we would go out and film, and we were sort of back and forth. And so it took us 2 hours to get the first 2 shots. The first scene that we were filming at my house was actually quite simple, but it took us quite some time to finish. Thankfully, we were doing our multicam shoot, so it allowed us to cut down some of that extra time that would have been there otherwise. Another problem that we came across, which was my fault during the equipment prep stage, was not including a clapperboard. That is the unfortunate thing when you have a lot of things to think about, and maybe you're multitasking and filling a few different roles, is that sometimes some of those smaller details can be missed. And unfortunately, even though a clapperboard may seem like a simple small detail, it does add some challenges. So instead of using a proper clapperboard, we had to get people simply just saying it out loud and just using their hands to clap, and that kind of thing. Another weather element was the wind, and this can be particularly challenging, especially when your main lighting source for the scene is a large reflector. Thankfully, we were all able to pull together, get the scene done, and move on to location 2, which was a cute little cottage in the city of Kalamunda. Now, thankfully, the city of Kalamunda were very helpful in this, in that they allowed us to actually book the location in a very short notice. Typically, you would book a location with days in advance so that you have enough time to read through the terms and conditions and collect the keys, etc. But we booked it in the day before. We picked up our keys on that same day before. This was technically before the challenge actually started, but nevertheless, the city of Kalamunda were very helpful in helping us get this challenge done, and so a shout out to them for that. Location 2 required a bit more setup because this was the birthday party scene. At this point, it was all hands on deck. We had the DOP and the sound getting some of their equipment ready, but while everyone else, including the actors and extras, all helped us set up this birthday scene. And thankfully, birthday scenes are relatively simple, and a lot of households probably have most of these decorations already ready. We simply went through our drawers in the kitchen, grabbed out everything that was birthday related. We also asked the cast and crew to grab anything that they might have that is birthday related as well and bring it along. It took maybe around about an hour or so to actually get the birthday scene set up and ready to go. But thankfully, almost the entire film just requires this same setup. So once it was set up, we were able to start getting to work pretty quickly. One thing to know if you are the director for a challenge like this, it requires a lot of fast-paced decision making. Unlike with a normal film, you don't really have as much time to brainstorm the characters and do rehearsals and do tech recce's, etc. So on a challenge like this, it does require a lot of adaptation and sort of figuring things out on the spot. But another point with that is making sure that you're collaborating with everybody around you. Because you didn't have that extra prep time to get to know the story, it's good to understand that you might not have all the answers, and it's okay to reach out to everyone else and get some of their thoughts on the story as well. So there were a few moments where we'd be filming and maybe some of the crew members would shout out ideas, some of the cast might shout out ideas, even some of the extras were helping us just sort of figure out the best way to accomplish the scene. And while we're talking about actors, another thing to keep in mind with a challenge like this is the dialogue. While I was writing the story, I wanted to keep the dialogue relatively simple because I knew that the actors wouldn't really have a huge amount of time to actually memorize the lines. That being said, I do like to challenge people as well, so I did include a couple bits of dialogue that probably would have been a little complicated to remember. And it also just meant that us as the crew filming it had to be a little bit patient and maybe go through a few takes until they could get it right. We ended up getting it in the end, so it all worked out. Now, moving on to post-production. Post-production is basically all of the editing and anything that happens after the film is actually filmed. Although, one slight difference with this one is we actually started the editing while we were still filming. We filmed that first location, we got to the second location, we handed off the card to the editor so that they could get started while we continued actually filming it. Now, unfortunately, this is where not having a clapperboard created the main challenge. Our editor found it difficult to sync the footage and the audio together, and we weren't able to get as much editing done as I hoped we would during the time that we were still filming. But I'll get back to how we solved that in just a little bit. Another thing that we had to keep in mind, because for me, I like to include a little bit of VFX in all of my films. So with this one, it was just about deciding which things were practical effects and which things were visual effects. We didn't want to create too many visual effects for ourselves because that can be quite time consuming in the post-production stage. So when we did have a shot that did require a little bit of VFX, we typically found a way to balance the two. It involves practical effects and visual effects to sort of finish it off. I do plan to make a separate video showing you a little bit more about how I actually pulled off some of these VFX, because that can probably be a little bit too lengthy to fit in amongst this video. So the filming day was done. The next day, which was the final day of the competition, we had to have everything finished and submitted by 7 p.m. that night. I started at around 8 a.m., just sort of making up for a bit of lost time in the editing and getting some of those video and audio files synced. Now, thankfully, I have actually been working in weddings for just over 10 years. And in doing weddings, it has taught me how to quickly and effectively sync video and audio without having a clapperboard or any kind of slate. In order to do this, it includes actually syncing everything in the timeline. Typically, when you are syncing video and audio, you'll do it in the project folder, but we're short on time, so we had to go with the quick method. So syncing everything with this method simply involves dragging all of the footage into the timeline as well as dragging all of the audio into the timeline. Laying everything out in the same order in which you filmed it it should already make it pretty easy to actually identify which shots go with which bits of audio just based on the length of each clip. One thing to note with this method is that the video file does need to have some kind of audio. It doesn't matter if it's good or not, you just need to be able to hear a little bit of what is going on. The next step I did is zoom into each of these different clips and sync up the files by eye by matching up the wavelength of the audio. And thankfully, because we were using claps, it made it quite easy to identify where the scene actually started and ended. Doing this might take a bit of practice, but once you actually get to it, it is a really quick way to sync video and audio, and we'll probably try to use the same method when we do this challenge again next year. I managed to get most of this done, and then the other editor joined me in the editing room. We actually used two different machines. He took over and got to work on the main edit, while I went to the second computer and focused on creating some of those VFX shots. So with this, I had to leave William to his own devices to get the main edit done while I focused on those VFX. As I finished each different VFX shot, I brought it to him so that he could include it in the timeline. While he got to work with editing that in with the rest of the footage, I continued on with the other VFX, and we were just working to be as efficient as we could with the time. Finally, once I finished all of the VFX shots and handed over the files, I was able to join him at the main computer, and we were able to work through the rest of the edit together. Now, the first rough cut of the film did end up being too long by I think somewhere around 2 to 3 minutes, which means that we had to significantly cut it down in order to meet the requirements for the challenge. So we worked through it together, and this part can be hard because you have a story in mind, and now somehow you need to cut that story down and yet still deliver the same message and feeling that you initially had. Thankfully, due to my over 10 years of editing, I was also able to assist William in cutting it down into something that still made sense. After a few tough choices, we finally managed to get the entire film down to 3 minutes. Now, actually, we had to cut it down to even less than 3 minutes because we also had to include credits. Once the final edit was done, the VFX had been incorporated. We then had to move on to things like sound design and the color grade. William focused on the color grade, and for this, because of course we didn't have a lot of time, he used some LUTs. I don't personally have a lot of experience with LUTs, so William went ahead and started applying these LUTs just for a quick color grade. It isn't perfect, but for this quick turnaround, it did enough. And at the point where we started the sound design, the clock was ticking and we only had an hour left until the film was due. Thankfully, myself, our DP, and William had a collection of different sound effects that we could use. Our DP had prepared a few that he think might be relevant for this particular story, and we were able to use these multiple sound libraries to finish off the sound design. We did also grab a few specific sounds from a site that I like to use, which is called Pixabay, where you can get a lot of free sound files for your project. I feel like I use it at least once a week, and it is very handy to have, especially in a pinch. Then it came down to submission. We actually submitted the film with only 20 minutes to spare. And now I probably made William feel a bit of panic for a moment because I was editing and I was like, oh, I just want to do one more thing. And then I did that one more thing. It's like, oh, like I just want to do a bit more. And that's usually the tricky thing because there's always more that you can do. So it's important to learn how to tell yourself to stop, submit, and move on. We submitted the film, and at last we could take a breath. Now, of course, after the actual film challenge was finished, we did have the opportunity to go back into the film, make a few of those corrections, extend it past that 3 minutes, so that then we could start submitting it to other festivals as though it were a normal actual film, I guess. That is how we actually made the film. Now, here are just a few things that we learned throughout this process. Next time that we do a challenge like this, we are going to lock in a story well before the challenge actually starts. And again, in order to do that, we are going to come up with some stories that are adaptable in some way. There is a moment in the story where we can swap out an item for almost any other item and it would still work. There are ways that we could include some kind of dialogue while still keeping it relevant. And of course, fitting in a specific shot, there are a lot of ways to accomplish that too. So next year, we are going to come up with an idea, we are going to lock it in well in advance, and that will allow us to actually treat the project just like a normal film, while knowing that we may just need to adjust a few things once we actually receive the prompt. The second thing is working with the right people. Now, we were fortunate enough for most of our cast and crew to be excellent people We had a lot of fun on set, and that was the main thing. I wanted people to have fun. I wanted them to get along. Even though a lot of these people haven't met each other before, I think everyone was able to have a good time. And for most of the day, it did just feel like we were hanging out. It is important to find the right people. So on a film like this, especially when you need to have some kind of skeleton crew, it's important to find people who are able to show initiative. It's important to have people on board that kind of understand what is required with a challenge like this. It's kind of an all hands on deck. You know, everyone needs to help out with everything. I was the director of the film, but I was there also holding the reflector. I was helping out with some set design. I was doing whatever it is that I had to do. And for a project like this, it's important to have people on board that understand that they may have to multitask and do a few things in a few different departments. And the third thing is better equipment checks so that next time we remember to bring the clapperboard. That is how we made an entire film in just 2 days. At the time of recording this, it isn't yet online to view just yet, but it will be, so keep an eye out on our socials for that. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to doing this challenge again next year, and I will see you in the next video.